Hi there, good morning. That was awesome, thanks. Welcome. Thank you so much for coming to the garden this morning. I'm Lisa Whitmer, I'm the Director of Adult Education, and we're delighted to have you here today. We feel very strongly here at the garden about protecting the earth and helping it thrive and making sure that we do what we can to keep our nature, our trees, our plant communities strong and thriving. And so I really would like to thank you for being here today, for caring about the ash trees, and for spending your time with us. I do want to make sure that you're aware of another summit that we have coming up. November 3rd, we have the Invasive Species Summit, which, similar to this, will have experts presenting on the problem, but also focusing on the solution. So we'll have case studies from here at the garden, what's been done in the forest, as well as people from the city parks, state parks, Westchester Land Trust. And I believe we had a speaker speaking about sort of what's done globally with invasive species and what people are doing to restore the forests and the wild places and the parks, et cetera. So please join us for that on November 3rd. And also, before I introduce the moderator, I would like to just point out, if you didn't see these beautiful baskets that we have out in the lobby there. These are black ash baskets made with black ash splints. And this one, I'm not sure if you notice, is actually made with the bark of a black ash tree, and it's carved on the inside. So if you didn't notice it coming in, please do coming out. They were both made by Kelly Church, who's here today. She's here from Michigan, and we're lucky enough to have her honored, really, in fact, to have her teaching a Black Ash Baskets class today from 3 to 5 in the Watson building. So if you have time, you want to learn how to make a black ash basket that you can take home with you today, please find me afterwards, and we'll sign you up for the class and get you going. We have 4 spots left. So there's that. So now I'd like to present you to Brian Boom, Dr. Brian Boom, who's our Vice President of Conservation Strategy, and he's the moderator of the Saving the American Ash Summit. So welcome to the stage, Dr. Boom.
Well, thanks, Lisa. And my name is, she said, Brian Boom, and I'm the Vice President for Conservation Strategy here at the Garden. And that's appropriate because we're going to be talking about strategies today, about strategies for saving the American ash. Previous generations of people like ourselves that care about nature and trees were fighting the problem with the American chestnut, the American elm. So there are lessons to be learned from those episodes in history. But we now have a 21st century problem, and it's a big problem that we're going to hear about today. So while we're going to be gathered here to hear about the latest in the problem of the emerald ash borer, I'll just cut to the chase. And of course, as you probably all know, this invasive Asian beetle has an acronym, the EAB. I've learned that a pest doesn't have real chops unless it has an acronym. So the EAB certainly does have that. And we're going to hear how it's been moving its way eastward from where it was found in Michigan in 2002, when it was first discovered in Michigan. But while we're going to talk about the endangerment and the dire situation of the ashes, remember, I hope to have a positive message, because that's the reason we're convening this, because we feel the project we've been doing here in the last couple of years on the ash, the conservation of the ash, which was funded by the Sarah K. de Coizart Article 10th Perpetual Charitable Trust, for which we're very grateful, has emboldened us to feel that with the multidisciplinary team we put together, there is in fact hope. And we're going to talk about some of those things today. I mentioned the team. We are about a dozen of us, many in the room today, representing a half a dozen public and private organizations. I'll just mention those. The New York Botanical Garden, of course, the U.S. Forest Service, the U.S. National Arboretum, the Mid-Atlantic Regional Seed Bank, the Bluegrass Woodland Restoration Center, the Ecological Research Institute. So we're going to have 4 speakers. You're going to hear the last 2 speakers are going to talk about the research and outreach components of our project. It'll be Daniel Atha and Jonathan Rosenthal. But first, to set the stage, we're going to learn about the ecological and cultural components or reasons the ash matter from an ecological and cultural standpoint. And we'll have Kathleen Knight and Kelly Church talk about that, will be the first two speakers. So the plan of action today, I'll be the moderator, as Lisa said, and each speaker is going to have 30 minutes to be here. And if they would like to finish before 30 minutes, there'll be some time for questions. We have two people with roving mics. But let's keep it to like 1 or 2 questions, and if there's no time, we'll skip questions after each speaker, because we have blocked out a half hour we'd like to have at the end for a panel discussion. So if you can save your question for that, it might be best, and it'd probably be more effective because there could be some back and forth and discussion. So with that, I want to thank you again for coming today, and I believe you'll find the alacrity of our speakers communicating the many dimensions of the EAB crisis is really quite extraordinary. I think you're going to learn a lot from it. I know I'm looking forward to it as well. So let's begin with Kathleen Knight. Kathleen is the research ecologist based at the Northern Research Station in Ohio of the U.S. Forest Service. Kathleen.
Thank you so much for having me here today. This is my first trip to New York. I am so excited to be here. And I'm excited to be talking to you today about something I've been working on for the past decade and something I'm very passionate about, ash trees and what we can do about this threat. So for my talk, I'm going to start off telling you about the ash species of our region, and then go into this very serious threat from emerald ash borer, just a little overview and background. And then finally, I'll move on to, well, what can we do about it? How to prevent, reduce, and mitigate the effects of emerald ash borer using strategies gained from integrated pest management. So starting with the ash species of the region, so the USDA plants database lists 16 different ash species. There are 5 of them that are native to Ohio, which is where I'm based. And I'll tell you a little bit about each of those species. They inhabit different types of habitats, and they play different roles in those ecosystems. So starting with white ash, Fraxinus americana, this is an upland ash species that inhabits upland forests where it typically grows in mixed stands with other species like oaks and maples and hickories. This is a beautiful, huge white ash tree growing mixed in. You can see some of these maples and other species around it. Yes. Next, green ash. This is a species that typically inhabits floodplain forests in Ohio and elsewhere throughout the region. So you can see the green ash tree here in standing water. They do tolerate intermittent flooding in these floodplains. This is a species that can be dominant in these ecosystems. Some of my research plots have 50%, 60%, 70% green ash in the plots. So losing those trees can create a huge change in the ecosystem. Next, black ash. So as you can see by the range map, this is a more northern ash species. White ash and green ash have a huge range. Black ash is a more northern species. It reaches its southern range limits in Ohio, where I work. So this is a beautiful, huge black ash tree in early spring before it's leafed out. You can see in this swamp, there's a beautiful understory of marsh marigolds in bloom there in the spring. This is a more swamp tree species. And in our northern forests, especially northern Minnesota, northern Michigan, some areas up into Maine, there are extensive areas of black ash forests that are dominated by black ash. So again, this is a species that can be dominant in these ecosystems, can make up a large percentage of the trees in those systems, and so it's of great concern, this threat of losing those trees in those ecosystems. Blue ash, Fraxinus quadranculata. This is a really weird and cool species. So it's an ash tree that has either square or winged stems. It grows in high calcium sites. It has a pretty restricted range. We typically see it in areas with limestone cliffs where it grows intermixed with other tree species. And then finally, pumpkin ash. So this is a more southern species that typically inhabit swampy sites. So in Ohio, we have sites that are a mix of pumpkin ash and green ash and black ash dominating a swamp forest. And between the three ash species, they can comprise, over 50% of the stems in these swamp forests. They're typically mixed in with basswood or elm species. And so this is a nice pumpkin ash forest. The arrows point to two of the pumpkin ash trees, but there's also black ash and green ash in there. So now, of course, the reason everyone's here today, this threat. So the emerald ash borer is a beetle that was introduced from Asia in the mid to early 1990s. It was introduced in Michigan near Detroit. But it wasn't discovered until 2002 when there were large areas of dead ash trees. And even with efforts to eradicate it at that time and stop its spread, it had already spread far beyond the areas where it was discovered. So you can see the adult beetle is this beautiful iridescent green beetle, and the larva is this kind of white, soft-bodied insect that lives beneath the bark of the tree. And the larva is what really does most of the damage as it feeds beneath the bark. So this is in a dead ash tree, and these are all those larval galleries as the larva feeds just beneath the bark of the tree. And that layer, that phloem layer right beneath the bark, is where the tree transports all of its nutrients and water, and so these galleries actually cut off the tree's circulatory system and make it so that the tree can no longer transport water and nutrients, and the tree basically starves. Since its introduction into the U.S., the emerald ash borer has rapidly spread through the region. Each of these red dots is the first county detection for emerald ash borer, and this is just where we know it is. So it's incredibly hard to detect when it first comes into an area, and we usually don't detect it until it's been there for a while. So I've been studying, and a number of other researchers have been studying, the effects of emerald ash borer on forest ecosystems. And of course, first of all, it has a huge effect on the ash species, causing mortality of ash trees, and then of course, as those trees break up and fall, contributing to coarse woody debris in those systems. And then as an ecologist, I also study the responses of other plant species as we lose this important species in these systems. So as the gaps in the canopy open up, what's happening with the other tree species that are native? Or is it invasive plant species that are actually taking advantage of those gaps? And then, of course, effects on forest ecosystem function. So carbon and nutrient cycling, hydrology can all be impacted when you lose this species that can be dominant in these systems. So this is my one data slide in this talk. This is a graph of ash tree mortality in one of the 50 sites that I've been studying around Ohio. So you can see the black line is dead ash trees, and the green line is healthy ash trees, and then the orange is declining ash, so with dead branches. And in 2005, this site had mostly very healthy looking ash trees. As emerald ash borer killed the trees, you can see the healthy ash trees rapidly decreased. By 2007 and 2008, we had a mix of healthy, dying, and dead ash trees, and that's very typical for emerald ash borer. Often those healthy ash trees in the middle part of that infestation will rapidly die, as they do in this case. And by 2010, 100% of the trees in this site had died. And so this was very typical of what we were seeing in many of these sites, but not all of them reach 100% mortality. They generally are over 95%, often 99%. Because of this threat and this rapid mortality of the larger ash trees, and you can see on the y-axis there, it was ash trees over 10 centimeters dBH. That's just the diameter of the trunk. So the trunk was at least this big around in diameter. Many of the small ash trees are still left, but looking at this rapid mortality of the large trees, ash, 5 of our ash species have been listed as critically endangered. 1 more ash species has been listed simply as endangered, but it's of great concern. So we've talked about these amazing ash species in our region and this very serious threat that emerald ash borer poses. And now I'm going to move on to talking about, well, what can we do about it? So I'm going to back up and talk about integrated pest management. So this is a strategy that is used in the horticulture industry, in the agriculture industry, to deal with pests in greenhouse and agricultural systems. And the principles of integrated pest management are also very applicable to forest pests. And so the goal there in the center is reduced impacts of these pests. And then there are 6 different strategies around the outside that can be used. So preventative measures, cultural control measures, biological control, chemical control, monitoring, and mitigating the impacts of these pests. And so what I'm going to do for the rest of the talk is go through each of these 6 areas and basically give you a very fast summary overview of what's going on in each of those areas regarding research on emerald ash borer. So starting with the preventative measures, the goal of these measures is to slow or prevent the spread of the pest and also to assess the risk of the pest. So slowing or preventing the spread, of course, many of you have probably heard of the Don't Move Firewood campaign, burn it where you buy it so that we don't accidentally spread the pest to new areas. There's also a number of researchers, Rob Vinette and Deb McCullough, who have worked on what to do in an outlier infestation that's far outside of the main contiguous area of infestation in order to slow that infestation. And in fact, the city of Minneapolis aggressively implemented some strategies that probably slowed it down by 2 or 3 years there, which is significant. This is a risk map of emerald ash borer, so you need to be doing risk mapping to understand where to target your efforts at preventing and slowing spread. And also in terms of risk assessment, I've participated in some research. These are some EAB larvae in wells here that are getting ready to be tested for their tolerance to cold in midwinter, so they're freezing points, to see, well, just how far north can this insect go. Moving on to cultural controls, there's 2 different typical methods of cultural control. That includes breeding resistant trees or using silvicultural practices. And I want to just go ahead and say that with emerald ash borer, we have not discovered any silvicultural practices that actually reduce the impact of emerald ash borer on the ash trees themselves. And I want to put this in bright red. Reducing the density of ash trees in the forest will not reduce the mortality of the remaining ash trees. There's been a lot of misinformation out there on this particular point. In fact, what research has shown is that those remaining ash trees will likely die at the same rate or die faster. There are some good reasons to cut ash trees. One being getting economic value out of timber harvests, one being removing the trees preemptively if they're in a place they could fall on people if you're not planning to treat them with insecticides, or, as we'll talk about later in the talk, strategically removing a small number of trees in an effort to diversify the forest and get other species in there to mitigate the ecological effects in the forest ecosystem. But a good reason for removing ash trees is not that you're thinking it will help protect the remaining trees. So that leaves us with resistance breeding, and that's actually really promising. So when I was out in the forest after cataloging dead tree after dead tree after dead tree all day, on our way back to the vehicles, we ran across a perfectly healthy looking ash tree, and we were shocked. And so this picture shows a healthy ash tree here on the left and a dead ash tree that's been dead for some time from emerald ash borer. And so we termed these trees that were still surviving long after we had reached over 95% mortality in the stand, We're calling them lingering ash because they're lingering a little longer than the others. We don't know if they're going to survive long term, but they are surviving longer. And so I've been working with a colleague, Jennifer Cook, to actually test these trees for resistance to emerald ash borer. So what she does is she goes to the tree, cuts off a few small branches, and then grafts those onto existing rootstock to create a bunch of replicate trees. And then back in our greenhouses, she actually takes emerald ash borer eggs and attaches those to the tree and lets those ash borer larvae burrow into the tree and start feeding on the tree. She then peels the bark 8 weeks later to see what happened. And so you can find a healthy larva in the tree feeding happily, or in some of the trees we actually find larvae that are killed by that host tree, which is awesome, right? So this is what we want, and we're actually seeing that some of these lingering ash trees do seem to have resistance to emerald ash borer and do seem to be able to defend themselves against the emerald ash borer. And the eventual goal with this research would be to have trees that could then be planted in our cities again, or be used for restoration efforts in our forests. So that work is ongoing. We're still searching actively for ash, and you're going to be hearing later about some really important work trying to harness volunteer efforts to continue looking for these trees. So the next category is biocontrol. And thus far, biocontrol has been done with introduced or native parasitoids. And so these parasitoids are parasitic wasps. And before anybody freaks out about wasps, these are very tiny and they don't sting people. A lot of people wouldn't even really recognize this as a wasp if they saw it. The one on the left is a native that we actually discovered during a citizen science project with some school kids. And the two on the right are Asian wasp species that parasitize emerald ash borer in its native range that have been brought over and released as a biocontrol. And what all of these insects do is they actually lay eggs on either the emerald ash borer eggs or the emerald ash borer larva, and then the wasp larvae actually consume and kill that emerald ash borer. So these wasps do not seem to actually be able to prevent mortality of the large ash trees in that initial wave of emerald ash borer, unfortunately. However, they do seem, some research recently by Leah Bauer and Joan Duan have shown that they seem to be playing a really important role after that initial wave of mortality that kills the large ash trees. There are a lot of small ash trees that remain. And these wasps are playing an important role in allowing those small ash trees to grow up to larger sizes and kind of keeping emerald ash borer under control enough that we can get survival of this next generation of ash. Chemical controls. So this is insecticide treatments to kill the emerald ash borer. This is my colleague Charlie Flower. He's injecting an ash tree with imamectin benzoate, which is one of the insecticides that's used to protect ash trees. And so there are a number of good insecticides that are currently available for people to use to treat ash trees in their yards or in cities. These are being highly used. People do have to continue to treat the tree either every year or every 2 to 3 years, depending on the type of insecticide that's used. And Charlie and I and a number of other colleagues are actually working together to think about how we can strategically use insecticides in forests as well to preserve the genetic diversity of the species. Monitoring is a really essential part of integrated pest management because it informs all of these other areas. So you have to know what's going on with the pest, what's going on with the host in order to really target all of these other control measures. And there have been a number of researchers working on different monitoring efforts, monitoring the emerald ash borer using the purple traps. So here's some emerald ash borers stuck to a purple trap. And then monitoring the mortality of the ash trees over time, and monitoring what's going on with those smaller ash trees after that initial wave of mortality, and monitoring the impacts to the forest ecosystems as well. And then finally, mitigating the impact of emerald ash borer. So there are kind of two different spatial scales at which you can think about mitigating impact. You can think about mitigating impact to the forest ecosystem as a whole, and that's restoration efforts are targeting that scale. And then you can think about mitigating impact to the ash species by conserving the genetic diversity of the species either through ex situ or in situ conservation. So the restoration efforts have focused on planting tree species that are not ash in these ash systems to diversify those stands so that the stands are still able to function as forests even as they lose the ash. So in this case, this is an American elm tree that has tolerance to Dutch elm disease. So these have been developed through very similar breeding efforts to what we're doing right now with ash. And it's planted in this green ash floodplain forest right next to a green ash tree that is probably dead by now from emerald ash borer. And so these efforts, there are a number of experiments. I'm doing some in Ohio. Tony D'Amato and others are doing research in northern Minnesota, black ash forests, to try to look at different restoration techniques, planting other tree species, to keep these forests functioning at least as forests, even as they lose the ash. And then the genetic conservation measures work to actually conserve the genetic diversity of ash species. So ex situ genetic conservation just refers to the collection of ash seeds and then the storage of those seeds in climate-controlled facilities. And in situ genetic conservation refers to insecticide treatment of trees in a strategic manner on the landscape so that we can preserve the genetic diversity on the landscape and allow some of those trees to continue breeding and producing seeds. And so this is a project that I'm working with a number of colleagues from the Forest Service, the Chicago Botanic Garden, and the Allegheny National Forest to think about these strategies in that landscape. And so the hope is that by combining a number of these different techniques, we could achieve that central goal of reducing the impact of this really serious invasive pest. And as you see, there's research is ongoing in all of these areas. So some of these areas we have some results like the insecticides. Some of these areas we're just at the beginning of having results. There's a lot of work still to do in all of these areas. And what's really exciting to me is the possibility of combining some of these different areas as well. So you can imagine if you had ash trees that have pretty good resistance to emerald ash borer and you combine those with biological control measures, perhaps getting those back out onto the landscape could go much better by combining those methods. Or if you're mitigating the impact of emerald ash borer through restoration plantings, perhaps you put in there some of these lingering ash trees genotypes as well, so that you can get ash, continue to keep ash as a component in these forests in addition to some other tree species. So going forward, I'm hoping to see researchers starting to combine these techniques and really give people a lot of tools in the toolkit to start to combat this pest. So in summary, there are multiple unique and really ecologically important ash species in our region. And there's a very serious threat from emerald ash borer. I don't want to give you an overly rosy picture. It's killed millions of trees. It's going to kill millions more trees. However, there is the potential to use these techniques to prevent, reduce, and mitigate some of these effects of emerald ash borer in a scientifically supported, targeted, thoughtful manner. And that's what really gives me hope. And with that, if we have a few minutes remaining, I'll take a few questions, and I'd be happy to take more questions with the panel as well. Thank you.
We'll have time for one or two questions, and wait till you get a microphone too. Just raise your hand, you'll be called on, and we have two people that will bring microphones to you.
Hi, thank you for your speech. It was really enlightening. I guess my question is, in terms of making a board or
Yeah, so that's a really interesting concept, and I think some of the things that we'll be able to grow and adapt with time are, using these trees that have some degree of emerald ash borer resistance, and then getting a diverse array of those trees back out onto the landscape to breed with whatever remains of the native population that was originally there that was too small to be infested. So as those trees get back out on the landscape, continue to breed with each other, they'll continue to co-evolve with emerald ash borer over time.
One more question.
You had some pictures of seeds. Are you working with propagating or repropagating through seeds? Does the ash tree grow well from seeds as a solution?
Yes, so the ash tree does grow well from seeds, and there have been a number of seed collection efforts that I've been involved in. The seeds that are collected and are stored at the National Seed Lab and other facilities are in a very climate-controlled environment where they believe they can keep the seeds viable for up to 20 years. And these are folks that are much better at propagation than I am and are experts on seeds. So I think that we will have very good potential for propagation from seed. All right, thank you.
Well, thanks, Kathleen, for that excellent and uplifting message. Now we're going to shift gears, having heard about ash as a biological entity and its dynamics with the beetle. Let's switch gears and talk about the cultural importance of ash. The general public knows quite well of probably the most important that we have nowadays in modern popular culture, and that's the baseball bat. The American ash is much used in making baseball bats. But we're going to talk about something a lot more traditional, going back a lot more years. And for this we have Kelly Church, who is a black ash basket weaver of the Grand Traverse Band Ottawa and Chippewa Gun Lake Band in Michigan. And she will speak on sustaining traditions, the effects of EAB on black ash basketry.
Good morning, everybody. Ania Nishna, Kelly Church and Dishnikaz, Hopkins, Michigan, Nedojibo. And what I just said is, hello, how are you? My name is Kelly Church, and I'm from Hopkins, Michigan. Our people have been working with black ash for thousands and thousands of years. We have oral stories that we have passed on to document these teachings and document our ways of working with ash. But of course, we didn't have all of the technology to show today like we do everything that we've always done. So this is a picture I found at my grandparents' house. I used to care for my grandparents. My grandfather got Alzheimer's. And I say that because when people get Alzheimer's, as sad as it is, they go back in time. So when my grandfather was going way back in time when he was a child, I got to hear a lot more of the black ash stories. So this is my family from back then. This is in 1919, and this right here is my grandfather. And so that's how we could date the picture. When I asked you all these, I was like, who are all these people? And he said, well, that's my mom, and that's me. So he was born in 1917. He was 2 years old. He was 1919. From this picture, we can document 5 generations with myself of black ash weavers. My daughter would make 6, but my grandmother said, we made baskets before they made cameras. And so I want you guys, just because we're here at this picture, you can see there's a man here, and this is a log, and he was the one pounding on it. We have all of these people putting them together. Those are some splints that have already been pounded off. And that wood contraption right there my grandfather is holding on to is a splitter that we use. But you'll see more of those in the upcoming slides. So the first thing we do when we go into the forest is it's all about the ash grows in wetlands and it grows in swamps. So we never really have competition in the woods. Sometimes we're the only ones out there looking for these trees. It's not a very busy place at all. So when we get out there, we begin looking for the ash trees, and we literally just kind of stand back and we recognize the ash by its bark, mostly. So when we're in the woods, we just start looking and we can see there's black ash, there's white ash, black ash, green ash, and then I just say, not ash, not ash, not ash. So I'm very very good with my ash trees, and all the other trees in the forest I'm learning a little bit more about, but black ash is the one I'm very particular to. This is actually a photo of one of the last black ash trees we harvested from the lower peninsula of Michigan, and what we're looking for when we harvest a good basket tree. So if there were 40 black ash trees in this forest, maybe only 4 to 10 will be good for baskets, if that. So not all trees are good basket trees, but the main characteristic we're looking for is the growth of the bark needs to be straight. Sometimes bark can curve around a tree, which means our growth rings will be curved as well. And if we're confused about the bark, which the elm is one tree that fools us a little bit, and we try to make sure we're getting the right tree. So that bark basket you guys saw earlier, when we're teaching our children in the woods about bark, you can touch on an ash tree and kind of go like this, and it's a little bit flaky. We call it kind of like a corky feel. So that is one of the identifiers if we walk up to it and we're feeling the bark and we're trying to teach others. It also, in the forest, it looks grayer to me. So when I'm comparing against other barks of other trees, it has more of a grayish tint to me. So black ash, we can also use our binoculars and look at the tops of the trees. If it's winter time, you can see this little tiny leaf bud. They look like little chocolate chips and they're black. And then in the summertime, we will look at the leaves, and we will look at this area in particular for no stem growing off the main stem, because black ash, the leaves grow right off the main stem without having a little tiny stem there like white ash does. And then we'll harvest the tree. So when we do that, we first will lay down some tobacco, and that's mostly just to give thanks for us taking a tree and for all of those teachings that have been passed on to us over the years. And also we believe they're little keepers of the forest, so we try to leave a gift behind. And then these are some boys that I started working with. So we started working with youth really early on, because the youth will be able to carry on all of these practices, and we give them knives, axes, everything. We just teach them how to use them right. And so these youth, this was their first harvest, and they're chopping down a good black ash tree. And you can see how dense these forests are as well that we go into. So when we're carrying the trees out of the woods, because we are in the swamps and you can see how wet they are with their boots, sometimes I'll step into that and it'll actually keep my boot when I take my next step, and I'll have to go back and get it. So it's really swampy, very wet. You couldn't drive a vehicle out there, so we carry them out on our shoulders. And when we're teaching our kids, we just let them do the same thing, because this is how we've always taught our children, is with our oral teachings and our visual teachings. So this is how we get the growth rings off of the log. The first thing we'll do is we'll debark it, and we'll debark it about 2 to 3 inches across all the way down the log. We do that with a draw shave. We use a lot of old tools, or we do it with the end of a hatchet or an axe. And in the summertime, there's about a 6-week period when the sap is flowing up the tree. So about late spring, early summer, the bark will peel right off the tree in one swoop. That's another way to do it, but we're primarily getting the bark off with a draw shave. And then we take the back side of a really old axe. So only this part is the important part to us. And we prefer really old axes, the kind that everybody thinks are no good anymore, are perfect for our pounding. You know, axes have those sharp edges. We don't want any sharp edges. And then an axe is probably about 1 inch in width. So when we are pounding, we literally have to pound straight, flat down with the bottom of the axe. It cannot be tilted one way or the other. It will ruin the splints. And then you have to overlap. And you have to hit as hard as you're chopping wood. So it's a very laborious job, pounding, but it's also a very specific, detailed job that not just anyone can do. And when you hit that axe down flat, this is actually my daughter. So when you hit that axe down flat on the log in that manner, it makes this noise that will resound. It's a very beautiful noise. And so back in the day, we could tell who was making baskets. You might hear a fast pounding or a slow pounding, and we could say, well, there's the church families making baskets today. The pigeons are making baskets. It will resound for about up to a quarter mile sometimes, depending on the day. And when I am teaching people to pound, I can also hear if they're hitting the log right, because it is a very particular sound. And if they do tilt their axe one way or the other, inside I'm cringing because they're ruining the splints. But on the outside, I tell them, I think you sound tired. Let's pass it on to the next person. And so this is my cousin John. Him and my father taught me everything I know about ash. So this is what we do after we pound it. When you pound on the growth rings with the back side of the axe, it releases the fibers, separates the fibers in between the growth rings. They will pop up and release. So you can see on the left-hand side all of the growth rings popping up. And with a good pounder, you can get about 8 to 10 growth rings at a time, because it does depend on how hard you're hitting the growth ring. And then we will pull it up. First, we'll pound about a foot or two across, and then we pull up. So he's pulling up, and we're only pulling the natural give. If it doesn't pull up natural and very easily, then we don't yank it and try to get it to come. We stop and we pound that part again. So it's very important to let the material go as it gives itself. So after we get the growth rings off, we will split it, and this is where the beautiful part comes from. So the outside of the growth ring is very hairy. It's not smooth at all. It's pretty rough. This is the splitter like my grandfather was holding on to. It's not anything, it's just something our people invented a long, long time ago. So it holds the splint steady for us. We put it up through a little hole in the side, and then it goes in between the top there. I score the top right across with a knife, just barely until I can tell it popped up. And then I take each side and pull it apart. So inside is the beautiful growth ring part that we weave our baskets with. So when you see a basket, the inside of the growth ring will be the outside of the basket, and the outside of the growth ring is the inside. So this was a time that we went and harvested. We were actually by Brighton, Michigan. So we were peeling bark off trees. It was one of the east side of Michigan was one of the first infected areas. And so we happened to get there right when it was waking up that year. So when we peeled back the bark, this little guy kind of looked at us like, "What are you doing? I'm tired, don't bother me." So he hadn't actually bored his way out yet. And it was, we had brought out a bunch of weavers from Maine to see what was going on in Michigan, just so they could get it. All they ever had was me going out there and telling them, we got this, we got that, we got this. But they really didn't get what was going on. And when they came to Michigan and saw all of this, it really, got their efforts going to try and, save their ash for as long as they can. So this is like Kathleen showed you. This is the same little bug. He kind of woke up a little bit more. And so for us, we're using those growth rings, and the first few growth rings are being destroyed. So one of the first trees I harvested in 2009 with boring marks and the galleries on the growth rings actually went down through 9 growth rings. And I know that sounds pretty amazing, but by the last one, it was just a little tiny hole. And maybe for the first 4, you could actually see bigger holes in it. So after that, then it would be just a little tiny spot here or there with a hole in it. So then we could kind of, for us, the growth rings aren't going to be good for our baskets, so then we started shaving off the first few layers. Of course, it depends too on how thick those growth rings are. So us ideally are looking for growth rings about the thickness of a nickel when we're harvesting a tree. But with the emerald ash borer, we've had to, be a little bit more flexible with our demands on what kind of tree we want. So thinner growth rings, of course, it will go deeper down in, and if they're thicker, maybe it would only go through 3. So this is what a lot of our trees look like back home now, because the woodpeckers love the emerald ash borer, which is a really good thing. It's really awesome. We see a lot of woodpeckers that I haven't really seen before, except for on the cartoon Woody Woodpecker, right? We all remember that. So we do see a lot of, the larger pileated ones, and it's amazing to me just to see these woodpeckers where I have not seen so many before. So we'll have small ones, big ones. They love the trees, so people are getting to see a lot more woodpeckers. They're helping us, but they're also ruining the bark on the tree, which the emerald ash borer is doing anyway. So we call this blonding back home when we see this. If you see a lot of that, you're in a really infected stand. This was actually in my yard, so I live in the woods, and we had a lot of ash trees die in the past few years. So this is what I was talking about, when you can take the bark off all in one fell swoop. We will literally just slice down the log and peel the bark off. And so this is the inside of that bark, and you can see that this was a tree that was not infected. This was in 2012, so it was a tree that wasn't infected here, but at the top of the tree it had begun. So this is more towards the bottom of it, but it hadn't been into a severe infestation phase of it yet. So we peeled the bark off and we made these bark baskets. So these bark baskets we really have to work quickly with. When we do take the bark off of the log, we will literally just give it a few little cuts and then fold it up into this. So as simple as that seems to make, they're so seasonal, the 6 weeks out of the year, that it would be something, maybe one year I could make 5, maybe one year I could make 15. These days, it's maybe 1 or 2. And so it just varies every year. But I look at these as one of the most important teaching tools that we will have in the future, because we are teaching our children how to identify the bark when we go into the forest. And if we do not know what the bark looks like because all of our trees are gone, these will be very effective for that. So now when I do bark baskets, I sell 1 or 2 maybe, and I keep a lot. So I have probably 30 or more at my house. We kind of lost count, about 32. But I look at those as giving them to tribes in the future, our weavers, our future weavers, so they can see what that bark looked like. And so we always say seeds over splints in Michigan, and seeing a good black ash tree that's good for baskets, you really do want to take it. But we've really had to exercise our control over that and say, we need those seeds before we need those splints. And like Kathleen said, up to 20 years, when we were at that talk in Bemidji, there was a man from the Montreal Seed Bank, and he said that they have studied them up to be viable for up to 30 years. So it's good because we do need some time. In Michigan, the lady who discovered was one of the researchers that discovered the bug, Deborah McCullough. She said, we're going to have to wait a few decades for the emerald ash borer to, leave our area or hope that it's gone, and then possibly replant some of our seeds to see how it does. So this was in 2011. It was one of the last times that we saw seeds down in the lower part of Michigan, and it was a really big seeding year, so it was really exciting. But this is in the early spring. You'll see these like little flowering, I call them flowers, and you'll see those at the tops of the trees, and then you'll know that there'll be these seeds later. And the seeds look just like those helicopters that fall from the ground. And then when you get all of these seeds, you could have 40 pounds of seeds. Maybe 1 or 2 will be viable, because there's also, seed weevil, little seed bugs. And so there's, things that affect the seeds as well that you have to look for. And so we're always, it's not every seed is a good seed. Not every tree is a good basket tree. And so working with kids has become so important. Never underestimate your children at home. Never look at an 8-year-old and think that they're not old enough to learn things. They're listening to you all the time. And so they're always taking in information. So I started taking kids out really young, showing them every single step, and borrowing people's kids. My daughter was older at this time, so I had a few families back home that literally would just lend me their kids, and I would take them into the forest. And so I worked with 3 boys, 10, 11, and 13. They're now 8. The oldest one is 18 now, and they're able to do the whole process. And so this was another tribe that I worked with, and even though these kids just look like they're having fun in the woods, they're going to remember this, when they're older. And so we call those making black ash memories, and I know we have all kinds of memories, but we like to say, there is blood memory, and scientifically there is. Scientific American magazine had a story about it. I believe it was 2 years ago in May. I read little articles when I'm traveling all the time, and it was about blood memory. And it said something like, if your grandfather a few generations back didn't like cornbread, you could not like cornbread just because of that. So we do have blood memory. And as natives, we always say that anyway, but that was the proof for everybody else that I'm not just saying there's blood memory. And so that's what we are doing. We're making these memories with the ash by harvesting with them still, by taking them to the forest where it grows, and by showing them how we get our materials, and by weaving. And so these are my boys when they were really small, so that's what they're doing. They're scraping the ash after we split them apart. We'll scrape the outside of the ash with a knife. We just kind of pull the ash splint through and hold our knife still. And so, you know, these kids are young, but we do teach them how to use their tools properly. And so these are pounders. Now, pounders, when I was talking about that, pounders are a really rare thing. So I tell people probably less than 10 in the whole state of Michigan that are really good pounders. And so not everybody does this job. But if you have a friend that does this job, you're always nice to them. You will never, ever, you know, cross that bad bridge with them, because they're the people that keep you in your splints. I know how to pound, but of course I don't pound as hard as the men, so I might get 4 or 5 splints compared to their 8 to 10. These little boys here, they learn to become very good at pounding, and so when I teach them, I have to recognize that they're young and they do want to do fun things too. So they would say, can we go fishing? And I would say, pound out 4 sets of splints and we'll go fishing. And they would get right out there and do it, and then they would bring them back in, then we'd go fishing. Then we'd come back and work, and then we'd go do some other things. So kids can learn everything. And I imagine them in the future being the ones 30 years from now, you know, like riding the bike. You know, you ride a bike, you don't do it forever, but you do know how when you go back. And so tools for teaching have become things that I use these days are I make little cards. I take flash pictures in the forest and I make flashcards out of them. So let's say they don't have a bark basket with them, they can bring a flashcard of what the bark looks like to help them identify it. The bark baskets, like I said, are the most important teaching tool that we have. Videos, step-by-step, real time. I have a video that I showed a videographer from the Smithsonian. She told me, you have to take out all of this boring stuff. Nobody will ever watch this. But to me, someone like me will watch that and get every single part. I'm trying to show them how long it takes me to walk into the forest to find the tree, how far we're walking in. I'm showing the ground. We're checking different trees and how we're notching them and what we're looking for, the straight bark, carrying it out. You know, you got to learn every little part, and then coming home and it finishes up with a pounding and splitting the growth ring. But that video right there, if you were to watch it over and over, you could learn everything that we do. Should these traditions be lost for a decade or two? And I'd like to point out we have had these traditions for many continuous decades and centuries. So, you know, we hope to continue that for a long time. And then also that seeing, feeling, and hearing pounding practices. That is something that's really important too. So this here is some of our ash stands back home. This was a one that was actually 15 minutes down the road from my house, and then we turned it into a bark basket later. Now I have to drive 7 hours away to get a bark basket. So before, 15 minutes compared to 7 hours. Now we're staying in hotels. We're searching new areas that we're not really familiar with. You know, and you can also tell where another native has been in the same area looking for trees. So we also have that where if we see trees that have been notched or a tree that has been harvested, we know there's another family going there, and then we will just leave and go somewhere else, because we're not trying to over-harvest an area, because as you take out the ash trees, the water tables can rise. And so we came up with a prescription about 2009 or 10 when we actually kind of realized that we might miss a generation or two of harvesters. And we said that if we went into a forest and we saw signs of the emerald ash borer, we would try and take out all the good basket trees within 6 months to a year before the emerald ash borer infects it. The emerald ash borer can kill an entire ash stand in 3 to 5 years. And the black ash tree is one of the slowest growing trees, so it only seeds around every 5 to 7 years. It gets its leaves last in the summer. It loses its leaves first. The seeds from a black ash tree are really interesting when they fall to the ground in the summertime, fall time, when they hit the ground. They go through the fall, they go through this, the winter, the summer, the spring, summer, and then they go through a whole nother year until that next spring when they germinate. So it's almost a 2-year germination process. So black ash can be devastated by the emerald ash borer before it can ever seed. And so we've had to learn a lot more about all of our forests as we've been, you know, dealing with the emerald ash borer. These are some of the baskets that we make with kids. So I do a lot of kids camps. I just take any child that is willing to weave, and we will teach them how to weave. These are square, round bottom baskets, And these are square bottom baskets. So we have been doing a lot of this, trying to teach our children, our elders to weave with the material. And then I'll teach them certain baskets, and then they say, well, I want to make a bigger one, I want to make a different one. And then I tell them, go out and pound the log, and you can. And so that's where, and I'm serious too when I say that. So that's where you get them, you know, it's like I can feed everybody fish, but I would rather teach them to fish. And it's the same practice with our baskets. These are some other creations that we could lose as we lose our basketry materials. We're also losing the materials to make our snowshoes. They're primarily made out of white ash and black ash because it's very flexible material. And then our cradle boards, this part here is carved out of ash, and this part right here. Because when you carve it and steam it, it can be very, very flexible, just like it is with our baskets. So these are very important things that we look at. We already right now cannot make any more of these because we do not have the trees anymore available to be carving these materials. We can still make baskets out of it because we still do have the trees in the UP, like I mentioned. But we have a study of ash trees on public lands in Michigan. We had 803 million ash trees they have counted. And when you saw with Kathleen's slide, the state of Michigan is almost entirely in red. So I tell people, for sure, we have lost over 500 million ash trees. The mitten part of Michigan is, I like to say, totally decimated. But when I say that, I mean decimated of the older ash trees. The seedlings are still coming up at this point. But the emerald ash borer will eat something just a few inches in diameter, so we're seeing how those go. But talking to even Kathleen earlier, she was saying sometimes the second round can be a little bit more hardy to the emerald ash borer than the first. And so we're watching those to see. And also we're encouraged by people like Kathleen. When we get to work with them, we learn things that are important to us when we go out. So looking for the 1% that is in a dying stand of 99% dead ash trees, looking for that one tree that is surviving longer than the rest or healthier than the rest in the forest. So that is something that we've all been looking for these days to assist those who do all of the expert scientific work as we do our fun baskets. And so this is something I started making early on when the emerald ash borer came out. It was mostly just a scare basket. It's called the 7th generation black ash basket. We like to look out ahead, 7 generations ahead of us to make sure that that 7th generation will still have the same things we had available. This is made out of a vinyl blind and ribbon. It's to show that we will be able to pass on weaving methods in the future, but we will not have the material. And that's what I really was trying to get all of the other native weavers, worried about. When I first, we had the ash borer come into Michigan, a lot of the other, like the Wabanaki, which would be all the weavers in Maine, and the Haudenosaunee, the Iroquois, which is the weavers in New York, they weren't really aware of the emerald ash borer, how it was going to affect them. And so I went to a lady from Maine, and I said, have you heard of the emerald ash borer? And she said, who you should tell about that is John Pigeon. And he was my cousin from Michigan. And so it let me see that they were not aware of what was coming. I held a few black ash conferences through the National Museum of the American Indian, and today, all of us weavers still today, from 2006 until now, we all work together, we get together, we see where we're at, we still work with the foresters, and we love when we get to work with all of our scientific people to learn the good things that are going on now. So that's all I have. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Kelly. I'm really glad we invited you instead of someone to talk about making baseball bats. This was so much more interesting. Thank you. And now I also know what it means when someone tells me to go pound a log. On that note, we're going to shift gears again to Daniel Atha, who's the Director of Conservation Outreach here at the Botanical Garden. And his talk is going to be kind of looking at the issue of understanding the genetic diversity and the relationships among North American ashes, particularly those of New England and New York. And I will let him take it away. Thanks, Daniel.
Thank you all for being here. It's my privilege to present the work of our diverse team of professionals. Conserving the American ash is a challenge that no individual or institution can accomplish alone. My job today is to present the biogeographic history of the ash genus and the beginnings of a classification system that can be widely used by botanists, land managers, and citizen scientists. This is our team of about a dozen people that Brian mentioned, several institutions, including several in this room. So the ash genus is in the Oleaceae family. That family is fairly ancient. Family, it includes 600 species and about 25 genera. They are shrubs, trees, and a few lianas. One of the lianas that would be familiar to all of you is the jasmine. It's also in the Oleaceae family, and also includes lilac, forsythia, and of course the olive tree is in the same family as Fraxinus, the ash genus. So Fraxinus has about 45 species worldwide in 6 well-defined sections. So the classification of the genus has been refined to some extent on a worldwide basis, and there are 6 distinct groups of ash trees worldwide. The ash trees are trees or shrubs. There are a few shrubs with opposite compound leaves, mostly, and reduced flowers that are wind or insect pollinated. The fruits are wind-dispersed samaras. So there's not a lot of morphological diversity in the ash genus. They're all trees or shrubs with opposite compound leaves, as you can see in the illustration there. Ash are challenging organisms to study and to understand, partly for several reasons. They are trees that often take a human lifetime to mature. So unlike the Arabidopsis, which is the lab rat of the plant world, which can be reared in several generations within one semester, ash trees sometimes take an entire lifetime to mature and produce fruit. So they're very difficult to study. They don't fit into our typical semester or even a tenure track schedule that a lot of our world is centered around. So they're difficult to study academically. They also have opposite pinnately compound leaves with very little variation. So they're not like maples that have lots of different variability in just the leaf shape. Ashes are pretty uniform in their leaves, which is the traditional feature that we use to classify and to organize the plant kingdom. The flowers and fruit are usually produced on the twigs of the previous season. As you can see in this illustration, this is the upper part. Here is the current season, and this is the previous year. So often this can be a foot or more of separation, and makes it very difficult to prepare herbarium specimens from branch that has leaves and flowers and fruit. They have multiple sexual states, so including male and female, which is not too unusual, but also several hermaphroditic states where either the tree has either male or female flowers, or it can have a broad range of intermediate states. So it can have a mostly male flower with some pistil organs, some portions of the female part of the flower, and that can grade all the way to a mostly female flower, which can have some portions of functional stamens. And it can be a broad range within that spectrum. And not only that, but the trees can change their sex from one state to another, sometimes within even just a few years. So they're very complicated breeding patterns and sexual states. Hybridization is common in ash trees. We see that in the duplication of the chromosomes. That can have implications for morphology, for understanding the parentage of a particular tree and the variation that we see out in nature and the variation that we see in the herbarium specimens. And the species may be diploid, which is the common state. We are all diploids in this room. All the trees you see outside are diploid. We have 23 chromosomes. The ash tree, the typical state, has 46 chromosomes. Ash trees can also be tetraploid, which is 4 times the chromosome number, with 92. They can be hexaploid, 6 times the chromosome number, with 138. And through this project, we've recently discovered that the pumpkin ash is actually octaploid. So that's 8 times the chromosome number. So you think the cells are just jam-packed with DNA material in the pumpkin ash, and that's 184 chromosomes. So that's a very complicated process that doesn't happen very often in nature, and it's thought that the pumpkin ash might have one of the highest chromosome numbers of any tree that that's known so far. And that was discovered through this project just in the last year. As I said, documenting ash trees from herbarium specimens is challenging because it's difficult to fit a good specimen onto our standard sized herbarium sheets, which are 16.5 inches long and 11.5 inches wide. So the trees don't conform to our standards. They're challenging us to make good specimens and fit them onto our sheets. And our experience has been that the understanding the morphology of ash trees can really only be done from specimens that are flowering and fruiting. So ash trees they're no strangers to insects, to fungal diseases, has been attacking ash trees as long as they've been on the planet. And ash trees have evolved a strategy of, it's called epicormic branching. So they'll get wounded in one part of the tree and they'll produce these shoots in another part. And that's something I think that Jonathan will mention in his talk, is recognizing a stressed out, a damaged tree. And these branches often have a different morphology than the flowering and fruiting branches. And so we're focused on the flowering and fruiting branches to identify the consistent morphological characters rather than these kind of monstrosities or mutant features, which can be very variable. So the ash genus evolved about 45 million years ago. I'm sorry, I have a little bit more. As far as the classification and the taxonomy of the ash genus, the only so far worldwide monograph, a complete taxonomic treatment of the entire genus, was done by Alexander Lingelsheim in 1920. That was part of the Pflanzenreich encyclopedic treatment of all the plants of the world. And that was the last time the whole genus was completely monographed. And since then, numerous species have been discovered, and we've learned a lot more about ash trees since 1920. In 1955, Gertrude Miller did her Ph.D. thesis at Cornell University studying the North American species of the ash genus, so excluding the Mexican species. And since that time, primarily the work of Guy Neeson, has focused on individual species and their taxonomic history and their distribution as a sort of piecemeal basis, working through in preparation of the Fraxinus treatment for the flora of North America, which is still not yet published. Guy Neeson is sort of peripherally part of our team, and we're in communication about the evolving information that we obtain through this research to inform that treatment for the flora of North America and to inform future treatments for the classification in North America. So the challenges we have in classification are Fraxinus americana, the white ash. It might, in some isolated areas where you have only one type of white ash, it may seem pretty simple, like here in New York we have just one type of white ash, but if you look at the whole continent wide, there could be as many as 4 different species that have been alternatively classified as white ash, Fraxinus americana. So is there 1 species, 2, 3, or even 4 species? The taxonomic botanical community is not in agreement on the number of ash trees, even in the United States. So here we are in the 21st century, and we're threatened with extinction of our ash, and we're not even sure how many species we might lose. So that's part of the urgency of our work, is to get as much information as we can to beef up our toolkit to inform the breeding efforts and the seed collection to have a robust classification system for the ash. So it goes on, Fraxinus pennsylvanica, also, as probably many of you know that have looked at green ash slash red ash, it's not so simple. There are pubescent forms, there are glabrous forms, there are forms with large leaves and forms with small leaves. And each of those morphological variants have been classified as subspecies or varieties. And so teasing some of that out and determining the taxonomic significance of that morphological variation is very important for the genetics and for understanding the distribution of the different genetic forms. And in Norse mythology, the ash tree is the center of the cosmos and is the source of all wisdom. And it seems that ash trees continue to defy our powers of comprehension, and I think we would be wise to keep them around. So ash trees diverged from a common ancestor about 45 million years ago. That's during the Miocene epoch, and the Miocene epoch began with high concentrations of CO2 in the atmosphere. It was very warm then. There were dawn redwoods and bald cypresses at both poles. So the climate was much, much hotter 45 million years ago. And during the Miocene and moving into the Eocene and moving into the Miocene, the climate cooled off, and there were periods of very cold temperatures and ice existing at the poles and covering varying parts of the planet. And during this time, the major groups of mammals also evolved. So the familiar mammals that we know today began to evolve during this period of a changing climate are the rodents, marsupials, the ungulates, and also the primates began to evolve around 40 million years ago. So, and the group also diverged after that. So the divergence is the appearance of a distinct group separate from a common ancestor. And irradiation is the speciation, so the evolution of new species of morphological variation. And in this group of the very first group of ashes to evolve, here in the southwestern U.S. Took about 30 million years. And today there are 3 species in existence from this group. There may have been many, many more that are now extinct. We have 3 left. There are 2 species here in the southwestern U.S. and 1 species here, which is the blue ash, the Fraxinus quadrangulata. And you can see an example of this tree. I like to call it a dinosaur tree because it's the descendant of the oldest group of ashes right out here on the lawn in front of the library building, just to the east of the tulip tree alley. So these are small trees and shrubs, and one of the features they all share in common is a winged stem and a quadrangular stem. That's where Fraxinus quadrangulata gets its name, from the winged angled stem. And the species in this group were not very well classified until the molecular work was done to unite them together, and using that understanding from molecular systematics, it was found that the smaller trees and shrubs in the desert also had very subtly winged stems. So that was a character that was elucidated through the molecular analysis. So you notice a clustering of particular species. One of them has a very obvious character, and then you look for that character in some of the other ones where it was not observed before, and lo and behold, if you look carefully, you find that character. So that's how the refined classification, using all the tools at our disposal, including the DNA, can inform our morphological understanding of a particular group. I'm going to go quickly. This is the Melioides section of the genus. It evolved also around the same time during the Eocene. The Eocene, as I mentioned, was a period of fluctuating climate and getting colder, and this was also when broadleaved trees appeared with a deciduous habit. Grasses also appeared that were adapted to a drier, colder climate. And this is when most of our North American species of ash evolved. So all of the ashes that were mentioned, well, not the black ash, but the green ash and the white ash are in the section Melioides that are familiar to us. These are shrubs or trees. They have no petals, and the flowers are strictly unisexual. So the trees are dioecious, and that's a unique character in the classification of the genus, that all of our species in the Melioides are strictly one sex or the other. They don't have any of the intermediacy that's found in the other groups. Section Pauciflori is a smaller section, contains 4 or 5 species. They are shrubs or trees. They have small leaves, very leathery, as might be expected in a desert climate, and they also have a winged rachis. So they're a little bit similar to our winged sumac. The leaves look quite similar. And as I mentioned, there are 4 or 5 species going all the way down into Guatemala, and this is the poorest known group of the whole genus, and there may be 2 or 3 additional species in Mexico that are not yet well known. Section Ornis is the largest section, has 15 species in it. It evolved about, diverged from a common ancestor about 38 million years ago. They're all trees, and unlike the other groups, the flowers are produced on the shoots of the current season. So this is a unique feature that evolved in Asia. And as I mentioned, there are 15 or 16 species. And one of the most common species, perhaps familiar to at least the name, might be familiar, is the manna ash, the flowering ash, and that was tapped, not unlike maple syrup, or the bark was slashed and the syrup was obtained from the tree, which contains mannitol, which is a kind of sugar, and that's the origin of the name manna from heaven, was sugar raining down. It was from an ash tree from Eurasia. Section Cyadanthus is the smallest section, has only 2 species. One which has a very broad range from Morocco all the way to the Himalayas, and then also a very rare species in Hubei province in China. And this group is sister to the next group, which I'm going to show, the section Fraxinus, which was the last section to evolve, the youngest section. These are small trees or shrubs, also has a winged rachis and no petals, and these trees are polygamous, so they have a diverse range of sexual states. This is section Fraxinus. This contains the black ash. This is the youngest group to have evolved about 18 million years ago. And as you can see, they evolved, these are mostly north temperate trees, adapted to a colder climate. They're large to medium-sized trees, and these trees all share the characteristic of having sessile leaflets. So that's what Kelly was talking about. They have no stalks. So the leaflet is actually attached to the rachis without a stalk. And that's one of the characters which we can use to recognize the black ash. The calyx is absent and the petals are absent. These are have diverse range of sexual states, from polygamous, andromonoecious, to strictly dioecious with males and females. There are 4 species in Asia, Eurasia, Europe, Asia, and 1 species in North America. So that's the state of the genus Fraxinus as we apply the resources of our team, ranging across several disciplines, and we're working on as I mentioned, a classification system for ash that can inform breeding efforts. It can inform seed collection, and also land managers to conserve the diversity within a particular species, so that we have conserved as much genetic diversity as possible for future breeding of the trees, either natural or through artificial breeding. So in the field, we've collected 352 samples from Maine all the way down to Florida, and including Texas, with a concentration on the northeastern United States and the species which occur in the Northeast. All species of Fraxinus in the eastern United States have been sampled, with multiple samples of each species. We've analyzed over 2,600 herbarium specimens of the genus Fraxinus. That's just the number we have in our herbarium here, the building just behind you. And our colleague Julian Campbell, which is here in the audience, has analyzed many, many more thousands of herbarium specimens in herbaria all across the eastern United States. For most of those herbarium specimens, we've collected a DNA sample and brought that here to New York, where it's been analyzed in our laboratory. And we've also collected tissue samples for chromosome analysis to be done at the National Arboretum. So a total of 284 samples were analyzed for chromosome study. As a result, this is just hot off the press or out of the sequencer. This is the latest morphological tree. Some of you may not be familiar with how this works. Is we put 210, we extracted DNA from 380 samples, and out of those we selected 210 to amplify the DNA and sequence the chromosomes. It's a fairly expensive and laborious process, and we chose the 210 best samples, which range the entire diversity of the genus worldwide, with a focus here. You can see green, the section Melioides, which is the American section, with a heavy concentration on the American. This is the most complete assessment of the American section of the genus ever done. So there have been a few worldwide phylogenetic DNA analyses of the genus Fraxinus, and our colleagues in Europe are working very hard to sequence the entire genome of the common ash, the Fraxinus excelsior, that occurs in Europe. But most of those analyses have included only 1 or 2 samples of the American species. So here we've included dozens of samples of each of the American species. So we have very robust results here. You can see these are the other sections of the genus that have very good resolution. So these branch lengths are an indication of the amount of separation that and the cohesion of that particular gene sequence. I should mention these are 5 genes that are sequenced here, 2 nuclear genes and 3 chloroplast genes. And in the future, we plan to expand that to additional DNA sequencing techniques involving orders of magnitude more DNA to hopefully get a better resolution in this American section. So this is dipetally. This is the oldest section to have evolved. You can see it's here at the base of the tree. And it goes up, and you can see here we have very clear distinction between the sections, good branch lengths, but you can see that's not the case with the American species, and that's probably due to some extent hybridization. It's also due to their very recent evolution. So there just has not been a lot of evolution in their gene sequences in such a short amount of time. One feature that we can see, though, is a distinction between this group here at the top and this group here at the bottom. These are almost all Fraxinus pennsylvanica, that's the green ash, and these are the white ash section here is the Fraxinus americana. So we're getting some clarity on 2 clades in the evolution of the majority of North American ash trees into a green ash clade, Fraxinus pennsylvanica, and a white ash clade. And understanding the genetics of those will help us in our seed collection, our breeding efforts. So I don't have time to go into all of the details of the different species, but as I mentioned, the cladistic and the phylogenetic analysis and the study of herbarium specimens and plants in the field is informing our understanding of the field characters that can be used by a diverse group to identify these particular species. So through these different techniques of our diverse team, we're discovering new characters that can be used. So in Fraxinus pennsylvanica, we've identified that they are all diploid species. They have 2n equals 46. The white ash, Fraxinus americana, is also diploid. And here is the pumpkin ash, which with the very large fruits is octoploid. And so using these characters, we can identify new features to use in the identification and classification. And these illustrations and maps will be used in a forthcoming publication, a field guide to the ashes of eastern North America. So these are some of the publications that have come out already and are planned for the future. So our colleague Julian Campbell did a very detailed principal component analysis of the green ash group, spanning the entire range of the genus. We're submitting a publication on the chromosome numbers of ash trees in North America. First analysis, broad analysis of that. And we're planning preparation of the family and the genus for the upcoming revision to the Gleason and Cronquist Manual, which many of you probably know is the standard reference for the flora of northeastern North America, and will stand as the reference for probably 20 or 30 years until that work is revised again. So the classifications which we come up with and which inform that revision will be what's used throughout the northeastern United States for the next generation, really. So it's very critical that we have a scientifically sound classification system for the ash that can be used by diverse groups. As I mentioned, we'll have a field guide, and we'll also publish a paper on the DNA analysis, the phylogeny, the most complete picture of the phylogenetic history of the ashes of North America. So I'd like to thank the Koizart Trust and the USDA for their financial support. So thank you very much.
Okay, thanks Daniel for that exhaustive and great overview. Let's now switch to our last presentation this morning. Jonathan Rosenthal, who is the director of the Ecological Research Institute in Kingston, New York, and he will be speaking on monitoring and managing ash, a protocol for conservation and mitigation.
So I just found out that this is not in note view, so some of my prepared remarks will be invisible to me, and I'll have to ad-lib things a bit more than I was planning. Let's see, this, hopefully I'm not blinding anyone with this also. Let's see. Okay, so great, I'm going backwards. Forwards. Okay, monitoring and managing ash, a protocol for conservation and management. The reason we came up with this title, not only for the talk, but for our outreach program, is we really had to torture the English language to come up with a memorable acronym. And if you look at this, this is Monitoring and Managing Ash is MAMA. So we just refer to our program as MAMA. It's a largely citizen science-based initiative, so we want you all to come to MAMA. Today marks the formal rollout of this initiative, and as you'll see, there are 3 separate iNaturalist components of this, or projects of our outreach effort. We have those up on iNaturalist already. We do not have the instructions, which will be coming out on our website for this project, which is monitoringandmanagingash.org. We will be publishing that website within the next few days, probably Monday at the latest. We will have sign-up sheets here. You're not signing your life away. You don't have to commit to the project. But if you want more information on it, particularly we'll send you an email and let you know when the website for the project is out. Then please put your name on this sign-up sheet. We will be passing them around, I guess, maybe right at the beginning of the panel discussion. And we'll also leave one on the table so you can do that. So again, it's not a lifetime commitment. It's just that you have interest in getting some more information. Oh, sorry, I must be Australian or something. I'm going backwards here all the time. Okay, so right now, MAMA is designed for New York and New England. That's just because we have funding for that region, but it can be expanded. And why is it needed? I'm sure you all have a good idea about that. And that's, of course, because of emerald ash borer. It's killed hundreds of millions of ash trees, 99% mortality for the 3 common ash species in the Northeast. That's white ash, green ash, and black ash. Predicted cost of $12.7 billion through 2020. So these are all really scary statistics, right? And the natural reaction to these statistics is to be scared. And that doesn't necessarily produce constructive responses. In fact, we've done kind of a very informal analysis of how people react to emerald ash borer as it spreads throughout the eastern US, and we've come up with what we call the 4 emotional stages of EAB invasion. These are not too different from the stages of dealing with loss of a loved one, which is what we're dealing with right here when we think of ash. So this is a New York State risk map. It's a little out of date. It's from a few years ago that shows, let's see, let's try to use the pointer function here. Hopefully I'm doing that. Let's see, maybe I'm not. I will point with my finger. Top center. There we go. Thank you. So the black areas are the areas that have long had EAB established. They're areas with really great, not great in a value judgment sense, but really high levels of mortality, approaching 100% mortality. So in those areas, EAB has been established for a long time, but I'm going to work from the other way out. So we have huge areas of the state where EAB has not shown up yet. And what we found from giving presentations is that people in those regions tend to be in the denial phase. And they tend to not show up to workshops such as these and conferences and not really want to hear anything about it because it hasn't reached there yet. Then we get where it's just maybe a county away, right, or a couple of towns away. Then the fear stage. It's about to come here, and I'll also call that the panic stage, which doesn't necessarily prompt constructive responses. We get into despair, and then we get into the areas where you have close to 100% mortality, and there's resignation, right? And people are just walking around with their heads down, and they've given up on the ash. It's basically, you might as well be talking about saving the T-Rex. And that's unfortunate because there are things that can still be done constructively even where EAB has been established for a long time. So here we have county level EAB distribution, and so the region that we're talking about this project covering is all this blue encircled area, and as you can see, the majority of that region still does not even have EAB. And then we have areas such as where we're located in Ulster County, New York, where it's approximately 100% EAB, ash mortality. So it spans that whole range, right? And all those possible reactions. But there are really important tasks that you can do to not only mitigate the EAB situation, the ash situation locally, but to help us in our endeavors to conserve ash species. So there are really important things that folks should be doing up in Maine and Vermont and New Hampshire right now, just as there are important things to do in upstate New York and in the New York City area. Okay, so here are a very quick overview of these important tasks for each stage of EAB invasion. So we have pre-invasion, EAB not yet present, which is probably New York City, all those other areas up there. And then we go on to early infestation, some EAB signs, some dead ash along with healthy and declining trees. This corresponds to the left portion of the graph that Kathleen was showing earlier. Then we get into the middle portion of her graph, and mid-infestation, widespread EAB signs, higher ash mortality, and a few healthy trees. And then late infestation, ash largely dead, with the remainder very unhealthy except for very rare lingering ash. So if we look at what can be done at each of these stages, so we have assessing ash presence and importance, which is best done early in the infestation process, even before infestation happens. But you know, suppose you're up in Ulster County, New York, and you haven't gotten around to doing that. Do it now. Good things can come out of getting out there and doing these basic ash surveys. Deciding which trees to be treated with systemic pesticides versus cut, for which there are some legitimate reasons, versus left for mortality monitoring and lingering ash detection. So making those decisions, you really want to do that very early in the process, because a lot of those options you won't have available once it gets to mid-infestation. Identify sites where mitigation needed. For example, dealing with possible invasive plant hotspots or changes in hydrology, such as Kelly was showing earlier with a black ash, and how you have to deal with things very early on, and I think maybe Kathleen also, before all the black ash are lost and the hydrology changes and the water table rises. So you want to identify sites to mitigate. Detect infestation onset. It's really important to know when that infestation starts and when you reach certain mortality thresholds, because that really helps with lingering ash detection. And then general seed collection for diversity. If you're going to be going out and collecting seeds, a good thing to send to the appropriate authorities, be it through MARSB or directly to the Forest Service. It's best to do that now before infestation is really heavy in your area, because even late in infestation, the very sick trees will often have really big seed production, and usually those seeds are not viable. Out where we are, we're finding dead trees that are completely covered with seeds. There are no leaves on the trees anymore, just all these seeds hanging there. Probably very few of them are viable. So you want to do that early. Establishing monitoring plots. We'll discuss exactly what that means. That's best done early, but you can do that with diminishing success and so forth as the infestation progresses. Assessing and monitoring mortality, detecting when that 95% threshold is reached, is of course going to happen mid-infestation to late infestation. And finally, finding and marking lingering ash, reporting for possible scion collection, scion just a fancy word for cutting collection to help them propagate these vegetatively, and collecting the seeds of the lingering ash. So those are really important seed because those will probably have some genetic component of their resistance. Going forward. So MAMA overview, it facilitates each of these steps as I'll describe, and it integrates what we call a global imperative for ash conservation into local actions, so that you're, the old maxim about acting locally and thinking globally. So we want to integrate that perspective. So here we have first a simplified decision tree which has strictly the local perspective. And this is kind of the mindset that people largely have been using, and it's not a bad one, but we can improve upon it. So you have basically, folks are thinking of three options. One is cutting, and it's entirely appropriate to cut potential hazard trees. And by hazard trees, we mean trees that when they start to die, and when they do die, will fall on human structures, infrastructures, and maybe actual humans. So those are good to cut down. Trees for commercial logging, we don't want anybody to lose out on their livelihood, or to maintain habitat type in a few very limited circumstances. And actually with the black ash, it makes sense to do some strip cutting in some limited situations that actually helps the maintain the hydrology if you're replacing with other species. Then we're talking about treating trees with systemic, usually trunk injected insecticides, such as Kathleen showed you earlier. And that's a costly process, and typically it's just a few trees with special roles in the landscape, a tree that you're really emotionally attached to, or that has a swing hanging from it, or that is an important aesthetic component of the landscape, and where it's practical and where it's affordable. And then the leftovers are the trees that are left to die. That's a very passive response and embodies resignation. Now, we're going to show you a very similar chart, which is the same, except that this integrates a global, both the local perspective and a global perspective into it, in that when you get to that third component here, these aren't just trees left to die. These are trees used for mortality monitoring and for lingering ash detection. And lingering ash are such an important part of our hope for the future, for conserving ash species. So these, long-term, are probably even more important than the other two categories. So instead of this being, the leftovers, these are really important. And it's an active response showing commitment to a long-term, broader solution. So MAMA website, which will be published, as I mentioned, in a couple of days, it will include information and links to tools for all the appropriate steps over the course of the invasion. So participants can explore the full range of actions and fit them into an overall ash EAB management plan. And instructions for our 3 iNaturalist projects, which I'll describe, will also be posted on that website. Here are our 3 projects. One is called Ash EAB Surveys. It's the initial surveys. I'll describe them briefly in a moment. Second is monitoring plots. Those are mortality monitoring plots where you're tracking the time course over which the ash in those plots are dying, and that will help you to know when that 95% threshold is reached, and 2 years after that you can start going out and really searching in the whole general area for lingering ash. And then lingering ash, which is actually finding and reporting those lingering ash, which are just so precious and offer a lot of hope. Initial ash survey management planning components. So this is in general when you're doing initial, you're formulating your initial response, which should be done ideally before EAB gets to your neighborhood. And so this is kind of the overall initial response, of which only a certain very kind of stripped down, streamlined parts go into our iNaturalist Citizen Science program. We don't want to overburden you, and they're just very particular data that we'd like you to report. So assessing the overall ash representation at the site, how many ash are there, how important are they in your system, assessing EAB infestation status, has EAB gotten to you yet, and is it killing trees where you are yet? Determining which, if any, trees should be treated, cut, or neither, that neither category being really important, and determining if loss of trees will cause particular consequences requiring mitigation. Example, imminent explosion of invasive plants due to canopy opening. So we have an example of that right here. This is one of our research sites in Mohonk Preserve, and these are, it has some really nice, big, old white ash trees, and here's one that's dying, and underneath you can just see this incredible proliferation of just about every kind of invasive shrub that you can think of. I mean, most prominent you have right here are lots of barberry, but really the whole kitchen sink of invasives are there. And what will happen is as this tree dies, these are proliferating, and this will actually be a source population for invasion for that whole landscape, which is otherwise relatively intact. So that's something where some kind of mitigation, such as underplanting the dying ash, right, so that you're replacing that canopy, and it's not so wide open and sunny and favoring those invasives, and also getting in there and eradicating those invasives. MAMA's role in initial assessment and planning. So MAMA can be helpful in a few ways. It provides links to planning tools, for instance, cost calculators that have already been developed, where you can figure out, you punch in the cost of doing trunk injections for a tree, and you compare it with the replacement cost for the tree and how long your tree will live and so forth, and you can decide if it makes sense to cut your tree or treat it. Treatment information, there's some really good resources on pesticide treatments and which are best in particular circumstances, and inventory approaches to doing quantitative assessments of how much ash you have. So we have links to all those tools. And then the iNaturalist MAMA 1 Ash EAB surveys, that's just the formal iNaturalist title of that citizen science project, and it enables real-time sharing of basic ash abundance and EAB infestation information across state lines, which is really important because a lot of the detection efforts and publication of where EAB is done by state agencies on a state-by-state basis. You can be in Maine and say, oh, it's great, there's no EAB in Maine, or be in New Hampshire and say, there's no EAB in New Hampshire, although I think there are some now, but they could be right over the border in the next state. So this gives a more regional perspective, and also a lot of these sites take a long time to get updated because the data have to be input and processed and so on. Here, by using iNaturalist, you can look and get real-time updates on what's going on in your neck of the woods. More stuff about the iNaturalist project. It's not necessary to ID trees to species, and that's because, as Daniel mentioned, it can be daunting to do black ash, to do ash identification, and he's going to make it both more easier in a way with the guide when that's published from here, but also a little more challenging because there will be even more species. And we don't want people to be intimidated and think of, oh, I can't do this project because I can't identify individual species of ash. So it's good enough for the most part to just say there are ash here. And the beautiful thing about iNaturalist, you'll post your photos and people will help you ID those ash. But we really just care, are there ash there? We're giving a special status or special emphasis for black ash for two reasons, both because of its special role in swamp hydrology, that there are certain mitigation measures that can be appropriate, and it has a restricted distribution. So on the map that Kathleen presented for the Northeast, it kind of showed black ash all over New York State, but really they're in very isolated and very rapidly shrinking pockets of the state. So they tend to be much harder to find. And also there's been very little work already done for seed collection and lingering ash work on it, so we need to really emphasize that. And also, the other reason is it's very easy to identify relative to the other ash species, because the white ash and the green ash have the diamond-shaped bark pattern, and the black ash, as you're now already familiar with, has this kind of flaky look to it. So also the iNaturalist project will help ID potential sites for mortality monitoring plots. Again, I will get to this, and can recruit help for them. So perhaps you have some ash on your property and you would love to have them more work done on them and more research and have folks come and monitor their mortality, but you're not quite up for it. iNaturalist is great. You're like, I'll make this available. Let's have some folks come and set up a monitoring plot here. And also EAB presence can be uploaded to IMAP invasives in participating states, of which New York is just one, from iNaturalist. And that's great because then IMAP invasives will have up-to-date spread information on EAB. So the abilities that are needed are you need to learn to recognize EAB signs, and you need to, at a very basic level, recognize ash. And this is also kind of a training program, because once you know how to recognize definitively EAB signs, you can carry that forward into the other projects. Say EAB signs, you're experts on these already. You have the serpentine galleries on the left. You have the flaking, the woodpecker damage that Kelly was showing us earlier. And it's not just the flaking or the blonding of the bark, because other woodpeckers can flake bark off for other reasons. It's just that it's so widespread. As the infestation advances, it will go from a few little patches to basically the whole trees being blonded. But in the flecked areas, you'll see these deep holes where the woodpeckers have extracted adult EAB, or usually EAB larvae. And then we have the D-shaped exit holes, and having multiple D-shaped exit holes, because sometimes you'll have them there as an artifact of other things going on, but if you have multiple, that's what you need. Things down here, these are signs of possible EAB infestation. So we have this vertical cracking, vertical splitting. We have the epicormic shoots that Daniel mentioned, and we have canopy dieback here. And those three can all be caused by any stress situation on the tree, so they're not definitive. If you see these, you need to look for those. Mortality monitoring plots and lingering ash detection. So these are the other two projects. Needed because mortality thresholds trigger the area searches for lingering ash. And you already know what lingering ash are. They're trees that are healthy even after widespread sustained mortality in the area, likely due to genetic resistance to EAB. United States Forest Service programs to find, led by Kathleen Knight, and breed, led by Jennifer Cook. Lingering ash have collected scions, again cuttings, and selected for resistance, interbreeding multiple resistant lines within species, producing highly resistant lines in 2 generations of offspring. So it's really amazing work that they've been doing. The effective resistance is even greater when the EAB population is lower. In other words, there's less EAB attacking the tree. They have higher functional resistance. And so this can happen when hopefully eventually the EAB population crashes due to having less available susceptible food supply, and also the other techniques that Kathleen mentioned, such as effective biocontrol. So together with these other elements, lingering ash offers even more hope. So USFS, lingering ash criteria, completely healthy crown, at least 10 centimeters DBH, that's roughly 4 inches diameter, 95% EAB cause mortality for at least 2 years, and can't be, this is really important, they cannot be trees that were treated, right? Because the reason those trees aren't dying is because you treated them, right? So, and they also can't be planted cultivars, and that's because planted cultivars is very low genetic diversity, and basically those have already been tested, and we know their ability to be resistant. So here from Kathleen, is that you up there? No, good, okay. That's somebody with glasses on collecting scions. This is, don't try this at home, this is for the professionals to do. And until now, the lingering ash search has been just in the Midwest, and it needs to be done much more broadly for locally adapted, diverse lingering ash from throughout the range for the broader breeding program, which is why I'm here and why we're rolling this program out. And there are 2 Mama I Naturalist programs to achieve this, monitoring plots and lingering ash. So the first one, monitoring plots, participants designate a plot of at least half an acre, and with at least 40 of these 10 centimeter trees. They count live trees and EAB killed ash every year to see when that 95% threshold is reached. And then 2 years after the threshold, go wild. You go and look for lingering ash, not only in that plot. You may not have any. It's a small plot. You probably won't have any, but you can look in an area around that, probably up to around 5 miles, depending on the circumstances around that plot. And then the location and the mortality data will be shared through iNaturalist. So we'll have all these dots on these maps appearing that will show mortality levels, and we'll get a big, broad sense of when these thresholds have been reached, and that will open the door to much wider participation, get lots of people out there looking for lingering ash. So here we have kind of simulated sites where we have a few of these plots, and this is similar to what you would see on iNaturalist, and you would see each of these would be a mortality monitoring plot. Third, the lingering ash iNaturalist project. Participants report findings for areas searched at appropriate time, typically 2 years after 95% mortality threshold reached, and so findings can be positive findings or negative findings, right? We want to know beginning then. And you need to be able to recognize ash trees, great. You're an expert on that already. And EAB signs, great. And also distinguish healthy trees with healthy crowns from those with thinning or dieback. So here we have these different crown classes, and the only one that really counts as lingering is going to be category number 1, full healthy canopy. So we don't want like limping along trees. We want those really flourishing trees. All right, if the 95% threshold is already reached, which is true up in our neck of the woods, up in Ulster County, then just wait 2 years and then start your lingering ash search, because we don't really know when that threshold was reached. And also, we may eventually be able to use some Forest Service monitoring plot data, but we're not sure about that. This is something we're working on at this time. So even if there isn't a MAMA monitoring plot in your area, we may be able to use some other data sources. Participants should also mark lingering ash. This is a lingering ash. Do not cut it. This is, please, that would be like such a tragedy, right? And it's almost happened in the past. And notify land managers. Lingering ash here. Do not cut. How seed collection fits with lingering ash, because seed collection has a role to play. Seed collection can preserve genetic diversity and local adaptation, but randomly collected seeds probably are not from resistant trees, right? Because we're looking at resistance at maybe anything from 0.1% up to 1% of trees, so like 1 out of 1,000 trees to 1 out of 100 trees typically. So chances are, 99 out of 100 that the tree that you're randomly collecting seeds from is not resistant, right? However, widespread collection is still worthwhile as a fallback option, and we really, because for some areas maybe we won't even find lingering ash, so you want this other source of diversity. And seed collection from lingering ash is potentially especially useful. So another thing, when you find that lingering ash, mark it, notify people, and if it's a seeding, collect those seeds, and we'll develop a procedure where you'll let the seed bank know this is from a lingering ash. Be careful, and here we have a photo from Kathleen's paper on survivorship. And so I'll just want to say what this disappeared in my notes, and I have to do this for my lawyerly side, is that a hard hat helps. It's not going to protect you completely from a tree falling directly on your head. Disclaimer. So that to do this project, and what happens is the ash, as they're dying from EAB, before they even die, they get very brittle. They're dropping limbs. They can fall at a moment's notice, even when there's not a wind present. So we don't want you to get killed, and we don't want to be sued. So if you can afford a hard hat, get one. You want to be really careful, kind of do things really fast, get in and get out. And most important of all is our condition for joining this project when you get to iNaturalist is you have to agree that you're assuming all risk and you're not going to sue us. Okay. Something not to do, Kathleen already mentioned this, great reasons to cut ash trees. Don't cut ash for the purpose of decreasing mortality or EAB spread rate because it's counterproductive. Kathleen has a terrific paper that shows that it increases local mortality, and there's another paper from another colleague of ours that shows that it actually increases spread rate because the EAB are looking for ash trees that they can feed on. They're actively searching. It's like, oh, there's not enough ash here, we'll go to the next town. So it's actually the worst thing you can do, and a lot of folks, unfortunately, are still doing this. I participated in a meeting recently where people were thinking of cutting 95% of their ash as their goal, as a preventive measure, and I had to very quickly get involved in saying no, no, no. Also, each healthy ash tree offers hope as a potential lingering ash. There are over 1 billion ash trees in our region. There are 900 million ash trees just in New York State. So even if 1 out of 1,000 has significant resistance, 1 out of 1,000 times billions adds up to thousands of potential resistant trees. Each one of these offers hope. Who wants to diminish hope? You're going and cutting these trees down, you're literally diminishing hope. Before I say that, I just want to say one other thing about lingering ash, that there is, the old philosophical question, if a tree falls in the forest and no one's there to hear it, does it still make a sound? Here we're concerned about the trees that aren't falling in the forest, right? The trees that are staying upright and healthy, and we want those trees to make a really loud sound, and those trees to be, that sound to be recorded, and we want you to be the ones out there recording it. A public service announcement, we're looking for partners throughout the region to host training sessions for Mama's Citizen Science projects. They are iNaturalist projects. We will have the instructions up in a couple of days, but it really helps if we can, in each locality, have a training workshop where we can really rigorously train kind of a few folks as a starting seed for the project to grow around, who can get on iNaturalist and really train everyone around them. And we're also looking for regional partners to host lingering ash breeding program. Right now, everything's happening in Ohio. It's pretty far from here. It makes things logistically challenging. So we're looking at potential partners such as Cornell and others to do some of the tree breeding in our area. That will make it a lot easier for us. So if you're from an august institution that wants to do that, please let us know. And I'd like to acknowledge, have some acknowledgments here. This is a product of the Strategy for Conserving Ash Trees in the Northeast, collection, analysis, and outreach headed by the New York Botanic Gardens, supported by the Sarah K. DeCoizard Article 10th Perpetual Charitable Trust, not the 9th. And we'd like to really thank Kathleen Knight and Jennifer Cook of the USFS for their time and insights. We've been working really closely with them on this. Thanks to Dr. Radka Vildova, who's sitting right there. Stand up, please, Radka. Who is Mama's co-creator and my partner at ERI. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Jonathan. Don't go away. We're going to assemble the panel quickly. So the speakers, please come up.
So we will pass these around. So hopefully we'll...
This is something we call the EcoQuest Challenge. And every month, just recently, the New York Botanical Gardens Ecoflora of New York City project started having these monthly challenges, each time to explore a different kind of biotic interaction. So we started with monarchs and milkweed. Then we had pokeweed in September. We're looking at the fruits and the birds that ate those fruits. And so for October, in which we're in the midst of, we have Fraxinus and fungi. So we're looking at the myriad relationships between ashes and fungi. So go online, check it out. There's a flyer that tells you how to get involved, and it's really fun and really easy to do and helpful. So all those things. So now is y'all's chance to ask questions of this distinguished panel. We have the same two folks with microphones at the ready. So just if you have a question, raise your hand, you'll get a microphone, and we'll get at it.
Thanks for your interesting talk. You talked about ecology. Has there been any link between the actual chemical composition of the soil and any of the lingering ash?
I actually have a graduate student who is currently looking into that. We don't have the complete results yet on soil chemistry effects.
Okay.
I have two questions, comments. About 3 years ago, I'm about hour and a half north of here. I'm in my driveway, and an ash tree, which had died, comes about 40 feet up, splits, and comes like within 6 feet of my head, straight down into the ground, causing about a 3-foot hole, depression into the ground. I've been told that that is the height at which these borers tend to initially come in. I don't know. Anyway. And the second thing, I've been on iNationalist, and I can't seem to get that program to function, other than giving me the name of monitoring the ash. I don't know what's happening.
So on your second question, we'll make sure that that's straightened out. We have the protocol should be up there. I'm surprised they're not, but maybe it's good that they're not, since the instructions haven't been published yet, and it's not a good idea to have people filling out fields when they're kind of freelancing. Second thing, as far as the height at which EAD attack trees, they tend to actually start very high in the canopy and work their way down, and they'll work their way all the way down to just about ground level. So you can go and find trees that are dead or stumps of trees that have died and peel back the bark, and you'll find serpentine galleries right behind the bark, just about down to soil level.
Other question?
Yes, I have a tree that I'm currently being treated. It's important for the landscape. A couple related questions. How long can I expect that tree to survive being treated? It seems to be stabilized for the last couple of years. The related question is, there was some mention earlier about traps for beetles. Would that help mitigate or are there
so it's not even all woodpeckers that are thriving on them. You'll get, as Kelly mentioned, like the pileated woodpeckers, the big woody woodpeckers, and Harrys and so forth. The downy woodpeckers tend to just kind of probe on the surface, and other bark foraging birds, creepers, nuthatches, and so forth, probably are not contributing a lot. So it's basically larger woodpeckers.
Species of birds in our property, and we have not seen woodpeckers attacking that tree, so I'm hopeful that that means it's not people who does it.
And the other thing is that if you're considering treating the tree, you really need to do it before it declines significantly. Otherwise, it's a lost cause.
I think it's also important to point out that preserving a healthy forest, so a functioning forest, is important to provide the habitat for those woodpeckers. So if it's a forest that's full of invasive species and doesn't have suitable large dead trees, the woodpeckers are going to go somewhere else. So we also need to keep a healthy forest with a mix of ages of trees.
I'd love to respond to Daniel's point, which is a really good one here, because we rely a lot on woodpeckers to do our monitoring work for us, and you can very easily do drive-by surveys where you see trees that have been woodpeckered, have blonded, and largely flaked. And we found areas that are more in suburbia where the trees are dead. They've clearly, on close inspection, been killed by emerald ash borer. We'll find the D-shaped exit holes, which you only find here looking very close, and there's no woodpecker damage on them. And that's because there's not a robust woodpecker population there. Your point is well taken.
I think we have a question down here on this side.
So we've talked about some really great important concepts like the lingering ash and removing an entire population of ash trees for the purpose of decreasing the EAP population. So how do we reconcile that with a lot of our major urban forestry strategies of managing this pest of treating trees, and also I know some cities are just going through and removing their entire ash population ahead of time. So how do we reconcile those two concepts?
In terms of lingering ash detection, because lingering ash
In the areas of North America where the emerald ash borer is prevalent today, the vast majority of trees are susceptible and have died or are expected to die. But there's a lot more diversity, as I pointed out, to the southwest of us and to the south of us. So there are up to possibly 4 species in the southeastern United States that have not been exposed to the emerald ash borer yet. And so we don't know what their mortality is. And they're also in the section Eleoides, the same section that our white and green ash and pumpkin ash are in. So there's another source of diversity and potential for traits that might be resistant to the ash. And also to the southwest, there are species go all the way down into Mexico, somewhat temperate. So Fraxinus UDI, which is a very common species around Mexico City and in Guatemala and Belize, that tree is also in the section Eleoides and has not seen the emerald ash borer yet. So what effect that will have will be interesting to see. And it's another source for hope that unlike the American elm, which only has a few species in North America, and the chestnut only had a couple of species, but ash is a lot more diversity, deeper diversity in the different sections and diversity of the particular species. So we have a lot more material to look through and more reason for hope because of that biological diversity.
Okay, let's take one on this side now.
I had a book a while back about the American elm and whatnot, and the groups that were going out trying to find disease-resistant trees. But they were going at more mindset to find cultivars that they could sell and whatnot. And it was very high sold cultivars, very limited genetic diversity. This breeding program you all are working on for the ash, is it kind of in the sense of trying to get cultivars, or is it more so just trying to get as many lingering signs and species to get as much diversity of resistance back out there?
Yeah, so we're hoping to do both. We're hoping to, as we first go along, Jennifer Cook is hoping that in the next 5 years we would have some cultivars that would be available for planting in cities. Obviously, it's a somewhat longer term effort to actually find enough different lingering ash genotypes that show good resistance that you can plant them in seed orchards, generate seeds, and then use those progenies for restoration of forests. And you need tremendous amount of genetic diversity to properly do that. And we are doing that as well with American elm. So there are cultivars now available, and those were those early efforts. But we're now looking to really broaden out that diversity of Dutch elm disease-resistant elm and be able to restore natural areas as well. So those efforts are ongoing. They're a longer-term endeavor.
And also, just on the side note, I just finished with an AmeriCorps contract with the New York Restoration Project. So Daniel, if I could get with you afterwards. Right when I left, they were working on a project where they've done some backbred American chestnuts. They're working on restoring the plant to the site, and I remember seeing a couple of ash before I left. So if maybe how you're talking about like groups that could train like citizen projects and whatnot, maybe they'd be a source to be able to help you guys work with that. So maybe some of the
Sure. Be glad to help with the field guide will help with that. We have some preliminary materials that can help with the identification of our ashes here.
We've got a question down front, please.
Yes, I have, now I know the technical term, limping along trees in our neighborhood from ash yellows. So I assume they're going to die from ash yellows before we can have to worry about the EAB. Is there any conversation about that with the safety of the ash discussion?
That is an important disease and a complicating factor is ash yellows, and it seems like it's geographically different in different areas. So in Ohio and Michigan, we have not typically had as much trouble with ash yellows. So that is another issue that does need to be looked into, and I don't know of anything that is currently being done.
Just a couple. One of the things about ash yellows is ash yellows can make it difficult to diagnose and to recognize EAB in its early stages, because those responses those stress responses, the epicoric shoots, the splitting and the dieback all also happen from ash yellows. And as a matter of fact, ash yellows complicated the early recognition of EAB because they were just being written off as trees that were dying from ash yellows.
I think maybe there's an opportunity to expand our team and some of the work that we're doing to include our colleagues in Europe that have been dealing with the ash yellow for quite a while, and so we can investigate their experience and hopefully learn from them as well.
Yes, sir.
Has the baseball bat industry participated in any way, funding studies, or do they have any concern at all?
Nothing that I know of, I was kind of hoping it would be some influx of interest, and there's nothing that I've heard at this point.
We've discussed this as a possibility at various points, and it's certainly our dream. And we would, I thought as a beleaguered Mets fan, I thought it might seem to, and it's heresy, I know you're in Yankee territory. As a beleaguered Mets fan, I thought maybe they could finally do something right, like having an EAB awareness day, and city. So maybe I'll reach out to them and see.
Give us a try.
Okay.
There was an article in the New York Times a year or two ago interviewing, I think, one of the manufacturers of baseball bats, and they basically, I guess, were in the stage of resignation, and they said, well, we'll just move to maple. But the maple trees maybe are they're next, so I don't think that's really a solution either. Finding an alternative, we want to keep the edge.
No bat will ever be like an ash bat though. The ash bats, they have a give, so when you see those bats crack on TV, that split apart, those are maple. And when you see the ones you can hit really hard that don't race, those are ash. And I also heard that they were turned to China to kind of good for ash species as well. So.
I just wanted to follow up on that. I think that the baseball industry actually really advocated to get funding for the invasive species, which I believe Senator Schumer did a lot of funding for that, procured funding for that, but so it was generalized invasive species. And that's, I heard about that.
That would be great. That would be great if that were the case.
I don't think they, it's not specific for EAB, but it was, they have funded like the prisons and different places did receive funding, and I believe that the ash, the baseball industry was.
So I'm on the steering committee of the Lower Hudson Prison, and we work on all sorts of invasive species issues, and that's plants and insects through our institute. So I'm not aware of that. I don't want to dispute it. If they're doing it, it's great. Some of the baseball bat manufacturers are actually based in Pennsylvania and further down in Appalachia, and I know that the ash stands that they relied on in Pennsylvania have largely been Pennsylvania and Central New York also.
Is there a question over here?
Do you know, have the ash barn beetles had the same decimating effect on trees in Asia where they're coming from? They haven't. So there's nothing to learn from what's going on over there.
So the ash trees in Asia have co-evolved for a very long time with emerald ash borer. So ash borer in Asia acts like a lot of our native borers do here. They can attack stressed ash trees that are already stressed out and dying, but the ash trees there have incredibly good resistance to emerald ash borer and can fight if it's a healthy ash trees there. It can fight off emerald ash borer. So we can learn from that. We can use that. So we can look at the mechanisms those trees are using. We can compare that to what our lingering ash seem to be doing. And Jennifer Cook's kind of second prong, she said it's a two-pronged approach. So one prong is just looking for lingering ash, but the second prong is similar to the American chestnut program, which is hybridizing North American ash trees with Asian ash trees and doing that process to try to get that resistance spread in.
And I also point out that section, House of Flora, the section with about 4 to 5 species in southwestern U.S. and Mexico is shown phylogenetically to be the closest relative of the Asian good reason to know more about, discover are there new species even in that section in Mexico.
Yes, ma'am, a question.
What makes the black ash the best? What happens if you try to pound another kind of ash?
We have never had to, so I can tell you what makes it good for it though. It grows in the water, so it's very flexible. We're able to carve with it. It just as Daniel mentioned, some group a long time ago that it is the center of their universe. The Wabanaki, which are the main native basket weavers, their creation story has them coming out of an ash tree. So, and we always say too when I teach people how to pound and everything, the first person to do this, how did they look at that tree and decide that this was the one? Did they go through a bunch of trees and do this? So in our oral stories, we have stories of, how we were given the ash tree to bring us together, to work together, to learn patience, because it teaches you a lot of different things. But we also have stories of, how it was given to us. And in my area would be, it came to someone in a dream to provide for them. So, we have not had to try other materials. And I like to say those lingering ash and the trees resistance in China growing along with it. I like to think that we're never going to have to use another material. And I liken it to someone saying, this language is being lost, just try another one. It's like losing that. It's like losing a language. So for us, I think we'll stick with the ash. We're not sure why it's the best. We've just been taught that way. And from every other thing that people weave with the white oak down in the Cherokees, our ash trees are the most pliable. We can do those beautiful decorations. If you've seen some of the baskets on the table, we can twist them. We can do all kinds of things with it. Split in half, and then take half of that, split it again. So it's just has some amazing capabilities.
We did speak with one basket weaver who was trying other trees. He said he kind of went down the same path as Major League Baseball, and he had tried maple, and he said, they're almost okay, but they're not as good. They splinter, which is exactly the same thing that happens with the baseball bat. So he was not enthusiastic about pursuing this much further.
You have a question down front.
Yes, thank you so much. I was wondering if you know the details of the major cause of the spread. Would it be, is it the beetles that are mainly spreading, or is it human activity? And if it's the beetles, how do they do it? And finally, in New York City, can someone describe the current state, as far as I know we're not heavily hit yet, but the current state of our situation and what's being done?
Well, the emerald ash borer has not been found in New York City yet, so we're very fortunate and counting our blessings. I think parks and gardens where trees are protected and where forests are maintained intact will hopefully have some kind of prophylactic effect. And perhaps the emeralds, I don't know whether they have aversion to urban areas, they spread more slowly, or whether we have any hope for continued protection. But the emerald ash borer has not been found in New York City. I think the closest is in Midwestchester along the Hudson so far.
And in terms of your question about how they spread, so the beetle itself, the adult beetles fly, so they can spread very slowly. They'll fly until they find an ash tree to infest, which sometimes isn't very far. They're capable of flying up to 20 miles, but they usually don't, because they don't need to fly that far to find an ash tree. So the primary way that it spreads, people have been spreading it, and all of the spread models that seem to fit well with how it's spread are based on things like where are roads, where are people, population centers, where are campgrounds. So those all point very much to human-assisted spread being the primary means that it gets around. And that's why that don't move firewood is so important.
We have one question in the far back there.
The question would be is,
and APHIS creates quarantine boundaries beyond which you are not supposed to be transporting. So they work very closely with the timber industry to ensure that the timber industry is not harvesting ash logs from Ohio and then bringing them to somewhere that's not yet habitable ash for. And in order to move that wood, they have to get permits, they have to go through special debarking procedures, and actually take off the outer wood if they are going to move it out of that zone, or move it during time periods when emerald ash borer is not active, and have all the wood processed before the emerald ash borer can emerge. So they are very careful with that. That is definitely a potential vector that they're addressing.
And there are also state agencies involved in New York. The DEC is involved with this, and also the Department of Agriculture and Markets. So they have very strict permitting processes also, so they are also enforcing local quarantines. And they usually, probably where we're at now in terms of EAB being spread around, anthropogenically being spread around by people, is firewood, being moved, and usually it's people who are not major firewood producers. So if you go to a gas station or a place like Lowe's or something and buy a bundle of firewood, all of those are certified as having been kiln dried and treated to prevent EAB and other forest pests from them. But you'll have places where people are cutting down their own trees, or around campgrounds, people just as a kind of cottage industry are cutting trees and selling firewood, and that has not been treated. And you'll have some leftover wood and you'll keep it in your car for the next trip. And also EAB are really good at hitchhiking on vehicles, which is why they also fit in these spread models in terms of being spread even if there's no firewood movement. So firewood restricting that is really important. I don't know really what can be done about the vehicles other than maybe making sure that there's not a little green beetle, riding on the windshield of the car.
In Michigan early on too, we had, if you see something, say something. So people, if you saw someone moving firewood, then to say something. But even at that, it wasn't as taken as serious as when we had $250 fines if you crossed to the upper peninsula from the lower peninsula, which was quarantined first with infected ash. So that worked a little bit better, knowing that you would have to actually pay a fine for doing that. They have voluntary drop-off sites for wood as well. So it's really just up to us to be aware of it, which a lot of people in Michigan still aren't fully aware of it. So it is just really us being educated.
Any other questions? If not, I'd like to thank our speakers. Oh, there's one more? One more. Julian, thank you.
Is there any pounding music when you actually beat the black ash? What does it sound like, and is there any music that goes with that?
No, we just do it at our own pace, so some people can pound faster than others, and some people are tired and it slows down. So, but yeah, it is very rhythmic. It is.
Maybe need a music video.
Yeah.
One more question.
Is there any place in the world where we can grow our trees where they will be immune from the disease for the time being?
I think our parks and gardens, as I mentioned, in particular here in New York City, is increasingly looking like they're going to be refuges for some of our trees that we're nursing for a period of time, as we develop techniques for protecting them, and some of them we can afford to inject, like in Central Park, where they'll protect them. So 50 years from now, no matter what's going on outside the rest of the forest, there will probably always be ash trees in Central Park and the New York Botanical Garden. So it's one really critical role that we play as a ex situ conservation refuges for these until they can be reintroduced back out into the wild. And as I mentioned, there's lots of diversity to the south and west of us for ash. So there's hope there too.
I think your question may have also been something like that, which had been attempted with chestnut, to find a place far enough away from EAB's range that you can have trees, without injecting them and so forth, and have them grow in some purely certified, EAB-free trees, or start from seed, or something like that, and have kind of a refuge there.
We also think of our islands off of Michigan as a place that we could probably start regrowing the seeds in the future first, because some of them may have less likelihood of being totally infected without all of the roads on them.
Great. Well, with that note, I'd like to thank our speakers for showing us all the dimensions of the challenge of saving American ash, for explaining so well the seriousness of the threat and the hopefulness of a solution. So thank you very much. And also like to thank again our funders, the DeCroixart Trust and the United States National Arboretum. And I'd like to thank you all for coming and showing such interest in this topic. So thank you very much.